If you've ever wanted to know how to make glitter and epoxy tumblers, but you have no idea where to start, keep on watching. I'm Alex with DIY Alex.
And I'm Kate with Kate Boyle Crafts.
And we are collaborating to bring you a magical series on DIY epoxy tumblers start to finish.
Collectively, we have over 3 whopping years of experience of doing epoxy tumblers and other epoxy crafts.
Yeah, we do. So we're going to show you a series to answer all of your basic questions. So we're going to start with how to prep a tumbler. Then we're going to show you 2 different ways to glitter a tumbler. Then we're going to make a great video that answers all your questions on how to epoxy a tumbler, followed by how to finish a tumbler and clean it up so that it looks pretty and perfect to send away to customers or to give as a gift.
Alrighty guys, next up is how to epoxy a tumbler for the full process.
So we are back. We've let our glitter tumbler turn for about 4 hours. So we have done our little knuckle method here and make sure that it is ready to go. So I'm going to get my epoxy ready. So for this one, again, this is just my little cheat. I like to mark my milliliter here. So we have 20 milliliters total, 10 of part B and 10 of part A. And again, I like to start with part B. It just seems to make mixing a little bit easier for me. So we will just get these together. And then this is what you're going to call a flood coat. So this is what you're going to do before you are able to apply any decals.
And this is basically what smooths the cup out to make sure that the decal can stick to the surface, because if you put it on right now, the glitter is really rough and the vinyl probably wouldn't be able to stick.
Do faster.
Yeah, it can be kind of a long process sometimes to get part A out of there. It's kind of a pain. And Katie mentioned that she kind of swirls it around the cup to try to even out some of the part A on its own. Just a little harder to squeeze.
Okay. And then I again like to use a thicker popsicle stick. I find that this helps prevent any kind of air bubbles, and it just mixes a little bit quicker, a little bit easier for me. So I've just tried to stick with a thicker popsicle when possible. And then I'm going to hit it with the heat gun just for a second on the top and bottom here in just a moment. And so it started mixing, so it's looking pretty cloudy again, but we're just going to keep on spinning. You want to make sure you get your sides and make sure that you're not missing anything, because if you have too much of part A or part B, or if it's not mixed well enough, your tumbler will still be very tacky after the 8 hours, and then it'll be a lot more difficult to work with.
Yeah, that's a good point, Katie, because a lot of people struggle where their epoxy basically just never cures. And that's because they weren't using a method that their part A and part B weren't even enough, so they got too much of one or the other, and it just never cures. So that's why we highly recommend the medicine cups. You can get them, seriously guys, super, super cheap. They might be like $2 for like 100 on Amazon. You can also sometimes get them on medical websites and places like that for like, I think I got mine for $1 for 100, so I bought like 5 at once, and a box of gloves for like $13 for like 100 gloves. So it's a lot of supplies, and you want to make sure that you have plenty on hand, because if you start getting into this stuff, it doesn't cost a lot for this part anyway, and you always want to make sure you have enough supplies to make sure that you're doing an accurate job, because you can go ahead and slap it on there unevenly, but it's not going to do you any good if you end up having to do it again.
Okay, so again, I'm just going to hit it real quick at the top and bottom just to warm it up to help it mix. And hitting it like that will also help decrease your micro bubbles. Okay. So and again, as it's mixed, you will be able to see that it then turns clear rather than that cloudy that it had before. So it needs just another minute or two. You can tell because it's starting to get clear, but still a little bit on the cloudy side.
If you pick some up on your popsicle stick, you can usually tell really well whether it's clear or not, because you can kind of tell whether you can see the popsicle stick through it or not.
Yes.
Or if you can't, it's still cloudy. I think some of the questions I see most often are things like, how much epoxy do I make, and how do I know if it's mixed, and things like that. And honestly, guys, a lot of it is just trial and error. You can take our advice and you can give it a try, but you know, you just kind of improvise as you go, and you'll figure out something that works for you. And worst comes to worst, you mess up a $7 cup and you try again.
Exactly.
No big deal.
Don't worry, we have all messed them up at one point or the other.
Yeah, I have plenty that are just unfixable. I just throw them away.
All right, so we're gonna get our guy going here. Okay, and again, you always want to make sure that your tumbler is even, because if it tilts too far one way or the other, your epoxy will start pooling, and then one side will have more than the other. It will be uneven. So you want to make sure that your tumbler is level when applying, especially a flood coat, but you always want to try to make sure that it is as level as possible throughout the entire process. Okay. And then we just kind of pour it on. And with the flood coat, you know, since you're adding so much, you want to try to be mindful. It tries to escape from you. So you want to just make sure you catch it before it falls, just so that way you're not wasting any. And you just want to make sure you get really good coverage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, guys, this is definitely a messy craft. So I know a lot of you sometimes don't have a lot of space to work with, and in this case I would say it is definitely important to find a space where you can get your turner, you can get it a little bit messy, and it's going to be out of the way of pets and children and anything that could mess it up or could potentially, you know, pick up some of the drips or something like that. So even in my last house, even though I had a craft room, my cat was constantly in my craft room, and I was always worried about him getting curious about my turner and touching my cups. So I actually had our washer and dryer was actually in our kitchen just behind 2 doors. So I would actually epoxy on top of my dryer, well, it wasn't running of course, and put, you know, everything down so that it didn't get messy, and then I was able to shut the doors the entire time while it was turning so that nothing and no one would get in the way of it or accidentally touch it and then ingest some or hurt themselves. So just be very mindful of the environment around you when you're letting it spin, because even as neat as Katie is being, there is still epoxy dripping down below and things like that.
And you always want to make sure to kind of get your rims, pay a little more attention to them, make sure they have some extra epoxy on there, because the rims are the most difficult part of getting nice and smooth. They are something that people tend to struggle with a lot, and I definitely struggled. You know, and they're just different things that after a while I was able to figure out what worked for me, and that's what I want to show you guys is what's worked for me, and hopefully it will be able to help some of you as well.
So Katie, what is it that you would say that makes the rims rough?
I'm gonna guess angle. Just because, you know, the majority of this is a flat surface, whereas, you know, at the top, since that glitter is sitting on top of the epoxy, it is still kind of sticking up and everywhere. So with those harder angles there, you know, I feel like, you know, it just has a little more difficult time, and since epoxy is a liquid until it cures, you know, it's gonna do what liquids do, and it's gonna kind of slide off a little bit.
That makes sense. Yeah, I've always found it tricky as well. I sometimes will take my fingers and dot a little epoxy around both the top and the bottom rim, and then run my finger, or like hold my finger in place and let it run all the way around.
Oh, like
so,
this,
yeah, I kind of dot it all the way around, and then I leave my finger there and kind of just let it smooth out. But guys, also remember that when you are applying epoxy, the pressure of your fingers is gonna either allow more or less epoxy to flow underneath them. So when you're pushing really hard, you're not allowing very much epoxy under your fingers. But when you have really light pressure, you're allowing the epoxy to be underneath and kind of stay there. So if you are holding your finger in one spot all the way around in a problem spot, make sure your pressure is very light.
Okay. All right, so it looks like it is, you know, all evenly coated. So we are going to allow it to spin for about 8 hours. And then once that has spun for about 8 hours, we will be back to show you how to sand and apply your decal and apply your top coat.
Later.
So we are back and we have our tumbler. It has been spinning and has cured for about 8 hours or so. So now the next step to this is going to be sanding. We're going to sand out any rough spots that it may have, and we're going to wipe it down with some alcohol. We're going to apply our decal, and then we are going to put our final coat of epoxy on. So I usually like to start from the bottom, and we're just going to do kind of the same method as the prepping goes, just in small circles. And if you guys haven't seen that video yet, we will make sure to link that in the YouTube card above and in the description below. So we're just going to do some small circles and get it ready for the decal. So we have sanded our entire tumbler, top and bottom, but what I'm going to go back and do is I'm going to pay extra attention to the rims down here and again up here, because these tend to be the most difficult part of getting smooth. So going back over it once again, paying extra mind to that will help with making sure that it's as smooth as it can be.
Is that still 220 grit sandpaper?
Yes, it is still the same that we used whenever we were doing our prep. I just kind of try to stick to the same throughout the entire process. I've never really felt a need to change.
Cool.
Okay, so now that we have gone back over our rims, they're nice and smooth. So we are going to probably change our gloves real quick and wipe it down with some alcohol.
So when you wipe it down with alcohol, is the purpose just to get the dust off and to clean in the cracks, or?
Yeah, pretty much. You know, and it's always a good idea to use alcohol since it is a cleanser. So that way it has a nice clean surface to work off of as well.
You'll notice sometimes that when you're sanding, it feels like you're really messing up your tumbler. It's never going to be the same again. It makes it look like it's going to be cloudy and things like that. But when you add your next layer of epoxy, you'll really be surprised that the epoxy just goes right over it and makes it beautiful again. But Katie is also pulling off the any little pieces left over by the cotton pads. You'll notice that in this series we have used cotton pads over cotton balls, because even though they still leave some cotton residue behind, it's typically a lot less than what a cotton ball would be.
Okay, so we are going to now apply our decal. Now that is obviously personal preference as far as where you want it to be. And today we are going to use Styletech Glitter White, and we get it from 651 Vinyl, of course. So we already have our tape applied. And I always like to take the backing off of my decal versus trying to pull the tape up because there will be some spots that may struggle to pull up, so that way I can just kind of push them back down and keep on going.
Especially with glitter adhesive vinyl. It's even
Yes.
trickier than regular or Cal 651.
Yep, the surface is a little bit different, so it can be a little more of a pain. But, okay. So we're just going to now, I usually just kind of eyeball it, but there are many different tools that you can get. There's even transfer tape with grids if you feel like that helps you. But I just really like using plain Jane, clear transfer tape to help. So I think right about there. What do you think, Alex?
Looks good.
There.
And like Katie said, I think it's pretty much personal preference as to where you place the tumbler and how you place, or excuse me, it's pretty much personal preference how you place the decal and how you apply it. If you have an ombre, it's a little bit more obvious as to where to put the decal, but I usually, like Katie, just kind of put it in that top half somewhere, but I try not to keep it too close to the rim. And as long as your epoxy is fully cured, you are just fine to apply the vinyl and transfer tape straight to the surface of the epoxy. You don't have to worry about it getting messed up as long as it really is fully cured. If your epoxy is still a little bit sticky or tacky, you probably want to wait until it's not tacky at all. After you apply the decal, it's time to put the final coat of epoxy on your tumbler. And guys, we just wanted to note for you real quick to always make sure that you take the proper safety precautions when using epoxy that you feel like you need to take. So every epoxy is a little bit different. You can find the material data safety sheets online that will tell you more information about what's in the epoxy and what precautions you need to take, but we encourage you to take whatever those may be. At the very basic level, you want to make sure that you're using gloves and you're not touching, your face or your eyes or your mouth. When it's on your hands, you want to make sure that you have baby wipes available to clean up any epoxy that spills. If you feel comfortable or feel like you need to wear a mask, we encourage you to do that. Use a well-ventilated area. Just make sure that no children or pets can reach your epoxy while it is drying and curing, because if it gets on them, that could definitely be dangerous for them. So there's lots that we could say about epoxy safety, but we just highly encourage you to be as safe as you feel like you need to be.
Alrighty, so we have our decal on and everything, so we are ready for the top coat of epoxy. So we have 20 milliliters, so 10 milliliters of part A and 10 milliliters of part B, and we are ready to do our top coat. Okay.
So that sanding all over the entire tumbler really helps that epoxy go over smoothly and have something to grip, because epoxy definitely needs something to hang on to. So I like the idea of sanding the entire tumbler like Katie said, instead of just spot sanding the areas that need it. And it probably helps the vinyl stick too, because it gives the vinyl something to stick to.
Yes.
Katie's applying the epoxy just like you've seen her do a few other times in this series. Just pouring it on and rubbing it in.
And you always want to make sure you kind of pay attention to the top here, especially since this is your top coat. The rims are going to be extra important for this last part.
What special attention do you pay to the rims to try to ensure that they're smooth?
I just try to find like a focus point. So I'll start here at the end of the E, and I'll just kind of go up and kind of flick it over. So that way, it makes sure that it gets above there. And I just try to find a focal point because oftentimes I forget where I started. So
you can push the epoxy up all day long.
Oh.
I've definitely done that before, and then you're like, wait a minute, have I gone around 3 times, 5 times? I don't know.
Alright, and then again, same for the bottom. And we'll start here at the end of the E. We'll just kind of go over again. Okay, and your bottom. And you still want to kind of go around with your finger. And you will definitely be able to tell the areas that have been sanded if they haven't been covered. So that's another reason I like to do the sanding on the complete tumbler. So that way, not only are you using the feeling of it with your gloves on, you know, any dry areas, but you will also be able to see where those scratches may still be.
Because they're still dull.
Yes.
That's a good idea. Is there such thing as too much epoxy on your top coat?
There is. So the more epoxy that you have when doing especially your top coat, one, it's going to make your tumbler heavier, and two, you run the risk of getting waves throughout it, because even though epoxy is self-leveling, you know, everything kind of has its own limit. So if you have too much, it's just going to kind of keep moving and it's going to create waves, and you're going to have to do more sanding, and you could run the risk of needing to completely strip the cup.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
So it doesn't even look like we used all 20 milliliters, but it looks like it's covered really well. I see we're at the top here. It looks like it has covered well, and around my rim at the bottom, I don't see or feel any other dry spots on there.
Good deal. So what's next?
So the last thing that I like to do is I like to use my heat gun. I let it sit for about a minute or so to kind of start leveling out, but then I like to hit it with a heat gun briefly, so that way we are able to get any micro bubbles that may be in there. But you don't want to hold it on too quickly, you just want to do a real quick little rundown. Alright, so just hitting it briefly. Okay. And then you just kind of do a brief inspection. Usually that quick little bit helps get any of the micro bubbles, so that way your final coat is nice and smooth. Okay.
So how will we know when the cup is completely cured and ready to roll?
So we are also going to be waiting about the 8 hours after we are finished applying the top coat. And then again, we'll do that same method where we want to just barely tap the bottom with your knuckle to make sure that it has cured completely, and then you will be able to go to the cleanup process. But if for whatever reason, if you've missed any spots or if it still feels a little bit rough, you are always able to go and do another light sanding and do another very thin coat on top of it.
Good deal. And in our next video, we'll show you how to do the cleaning and finishing process for a tumbler. Whether you are giving it as a gift or selling it to a customer, you definitely want to take the step to clean it up and make it look nice and pretty before you give it away.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up.
And if you learned something in this video, be sure to tell us what you learned down below in the comments.
Definitely. And if you want to see more epoxy and glitter crafts, make sure that you subscribe to both Kate Boyle Crafts and DIY Alex. We'll definitely link the other channel in the description below.
We'll see you in the next episode.
That's a wrap.